Mi megvédjük a határainkat, és csak mi fogjuk eldönteni, kikkel élünk együtt. Kerítést építettünk, és megállítottuk az illegális migránsok százezreit. Megvédtük Magyarországot, és megvédtük Európát.
Good evening and welcome to The World Today. Of late we've been doing a series of films and interviews on what we call the eyesores of the European Union, of which there are many and they're growing in number, Italy being the latest to be added to the list. Countries which are run by reactionary governments where far-right groups are quite strong, and where even more important than the numbers of the far-right groups is what has happened to the culture of these countries. This is, of course, most noticeable in Eastern Europe, where despite all the defects of the communist system, within the culture there were voices of filmmakers, of dissidents, of critics, people, especially during the last 20 years of this experiment in Eastern Europe, would write, argue with each other. There were the intellectuals of the regime, there were public intellectuals, semi-dissident intellectuals, and in some cases filmmakers played a very big role. With me in Miranda House in central London, where we're filming this, is Attila Melegh, one of the leading public intellectuals in Hungary, recently attacked by the government, who alleged that he had said that most of the immigrants who were coming to Hungary were actually better than Hungarians, a distortion. But nonetheless, he has been active to defend immigrants and many, many other things in Hungary. He is a historian, a sociologist. He teaches at Corvinus University in Budapest, and is involved in many activities which we can only call these days dissident activities. Attila, thank you very much for being with us. Let's first start with a bit of history, always useful. When the old system, actually existing communism, or whatever we want to call it, collapsed, imploded, in Hungary, a lot of members of the old Communist Party became social democrats politically, or became people who wanted to make money. This is a pattern now throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. So what were the specifics of this trend in Hungary? What exactly happened in concrete terms?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to sit here and to think about these things. I think Hungary had some peculiar features in this transition concerning, for a certain period of time, for a transition period, they actually did some real class formation in the sense that they were in charge of property for a certain period of time, and then of course property was immediately allocated to global capital mainly, a little bit left behind, and then of course there were all kinds of people who were signing up in this competition for this capital. This was one thing which was very important in Hungary. The other thing was that it was very much involved in global capitalism in terms of its economy. It has always been an open economy. It has been, and it had a huge impact how state socialism was actually functioning. The third thing, and then I finish, is huge debt, which at that time, it's very funny, which at that time was called catastrophic. I mean, in terms of international debt. But in case we look at the current figures, then, and nobody's talking about the crisis, but we have more or less exactly the same figures, how we ended up state socialism, but it was a good pretext that state socialism had to be finished because of the too huge debt.
So Attila, after the Second World War, when the Communist Party and some of its allies took over the country, the land was taken away from the landlords and redistributed or run by the state, and the same with the enterprises.
Correct. Imre Nagy was the person, the famous Imre Nagy was the person who actually distributed land among peasants right after the Second World War. And then there were cooperatives, there were state farms, and then basically all major companies above a certain number of employees, they were all nationalized.
But not all companies.
Not all companies, but some of the minor ones, but basically the economy was nationalized.
This had some impact, surely, both on the consciousness of peasants, poor peasants in particular, but also workers in the cities.
Absolutely, it's one of the things we never talk about. We hear a lot about the reminiscences of all those people who lost property. I think the rural poor was extremely happy about the change. They made an enormous mobility in a very short period of time. And also certain segments of the working class, they were also had a great advantage, and we never talk about these things. Plus at the same time, of course, education was reorganized and healthcare and all these things. So all those figures were just marvelous, and then they had a huge impact on the society. It became like a kind of an oxygen. We never think about oxygen only when we don't have it.
Exactly. And we don't talk about it now because everything is presented from that past as state repression, bureaucracy, etc., which is true, of course, on a certain level. But the socio-economic basis of these regimes was very interesting. And actually, people are now quite interested in what happened there, what was wrong about it, what was good about it.
Yes, we always say that socialism was very repressive in that, and that's true. That's not a problem. But it was changing. And it's very funny. I mean, nobody says that capitalism was once repressive. It's always repressive, nonetheless it still be does. But then in the case of socialism, it was repressive, and then it became much less repressive and very innovative. So you asked about the peculiarities of Hungary. So during the 1960s, there was a very interesting move of combining various systems of integration of the economy into some kind of a balance. So they started experimenting with a little bit of market. In the agriculture, there was a symbiosis between private farmers and then the cooperatives, and it was working out fantastically. It was, I mean, you can even now, you go to the countryside, you see that in the 60s and the 70s, people really had money because they could build and buy and then involved in this. While now, we see a completely idle countryside, which has very little to do with the land which is surrounding it.
That's very interesting because I remember very well that the reforms which were pushed through in Hungary in the 60s and 70s, especially after the defeat of the Hungarian uprising with all its contradictions, were talked about a great deal in The Economist, in the financial press in the West, as being a good model. They used to write that it's a good model which we only wish that the other Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union would follow. But in reality, what they wanted was not this good model, but a total reversal. But now, Attila, looking at the situation, Hungary has, there are lots of appalling regimes within the European Union. Hungary, you feel, is one of the worst. That it's very open about it. It's a sort of pre-Trumpism, if you like. That they say, yes, this is what we are doing. They don't deny it, so people know. Tell us something about this Fidesz, the Hungarian right. Where does it come from? What are its roots, and how far can it go?
So Fidesz has a long history, and then we have to go back to 1988. It was one of the first parties to be to be created. For a certain period of time, they were trying to position themselves with the, between the Hungarian Democratic Forum, this conservative nationalist one, and then between the liberals, the so-called Free Democrats. One of the big problems was that these people were also looking for some share in the economy. They wanted to have certain control. They were tricked, pushed out in various ways, of course. I mean, such a gamble cannot be nice, it can only be disgusting. And then I think in that sense they became revengeful. And then of course the big question was what kind of a political ideology would serve that and how history plays into this thing. And then they maneuvered to the right wing, then they conquered the right wing spectrum of the Hungarian political life at that time. They actually could monopolize themselves in that. That was, you know, a long and painstaking development. Nobody believed that they would be so successful, but they were successful in that. And then with the crisis in 2008, their time came. Because by that time, this opening up cycle, this neoliberal capitalism already produced so much contradictions in Eastern Europe that there was no question that they could capitalize on this. And then, of course, they started this kind of a new kind of a talk, new right-wing kind of a talk, which was, on the one hand, against the previous elite. People were not unhappy about
the
this.
Center,
yes,
the old center.
Yeah, the old center, because and people were not unhappy about this because that elite was, you know, abandoned them completely. So the abandoned working classes were, of course, looking for these things. Second, liberal capitalism was not anymore fancy because people could see what it leads to, what kind of an enormous insecurity it leads to. The labor market figures were horrible. And so on and so on, and they could capitalize with this kind of a new nationalism, new media techniques, which is super important, plus this new combination of some kind of a new authoritarian control and the neoliberal economics, and very importantly, and here comes the, I think the big point, that authoritarianism is not a choice. It's a result of a process. In case you want to redistribute property, and of course you can't do it through the market because the market is not working in that way, then you decide that you do it through the state has to be authoritarian because it's going to reallocate resources, to reshuffle the cards. And then this is the logic, this is the dynamic into which they got. And for this, they were looking for all kinds of, you know, political messages, how they could sell and maintain this state power. And that was the thing what you also mentioned, the kind of an anti-migration talk or anti-refugee talk, which also saved them in that respect.
Hungary itself, if we go all the way back, you know, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire as we know, but basically it was the Austrian Empire. The Hungarians were given a few things to be happy about and to feel they were part of the empire. But Hungary was itself for many, many years under the Ottomans, or parts of Hungary were. Then came the Austro-Germanic Empire, then came the Russians after the Second World War. Very different, but nonetheless seen in that tradition of Hungary not being independent. And did the right play into this, that this is the first time we are truly independent and our ethnicity is very important, it's now pure?
Exactly, because this is one of the key things they are talking about is national independence and national sovereignty. This is a key issue in Eastern Europe, has always been a key issue, and this is what they are playing out, of course in a rather cheap way, because first of all, you have to explain why you lost independence at that time and why you lost independence at that time. So, I mean, all those things are not the same. For them, the same, of course, because the nation is eternal, which is, of course, not eternal because it's always reconstructed. So this is one of the things. But here we come to a very interesting problem, namely that with the joining the European Union, plus very importantly, seeing this global unequal development, and then this region getting into unequal exchange with the richer parts of Europe, very much interestingly, importantly, in terms of migration. These countries have very serious problems with this openness, even in terms of population. I mean, there can be an enormous population loss going on. I mean, in case we talk about Bulgaria, I mean, Bulgaria soon can be a country of 5 million. And it can be a country where the working population at home equals the migrant worker population outside the country. Now, how to handle social security, how to manage a nation state on the basis of such an economy. That's a major challenge, and this is what we need to understand, that behind a lot of blah blah, there are very serious issues what these East European countries have to think about, and then in some ways they legitimately say that the European Union should operate a little bit differently, because this is not going to work out for them. The question is, of course, what they say and what is the solution for that. That's another issue. But here I think, for instance, the East European left could make a good point in case because then they could retake some of the topics of the right wing in case they are able to thematize this.
I mean, it is a similar pattern in many parts of not just Eastern Europe, but if you look, for instance, at what's happened to Greece, if you look at what is happening to Italy, this is all the consequences of the Wall Street crash of 2008. And the center parties, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, which I refer to them as the extreme center, have no alternatives. And in some cases, as in Britain, we've had the rise of a left inside the Labour Party, which has taken power, to everyone's astonishment. But in many other parts, the situation is different. Right. I mean, France deported the Roma people. Yes. The Italians are threatening to carry out deportations. The Germans have completely changed their line on refugees. The situation in Britain was create a hostile environment. That is what this government, Conservative government, said. Create a hostile environment for migrants, even if they came 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But what I wanted to ask you is, what is the link in Hungary between the right, Fidesz, the far right, Jobbik, and the old traditions of Hungarian collaboration of the old Horthyite and Hungarian right with the Nazis during the Second World War? Because in most other countries you can find it. And especially culturally, this is becoming incredibly dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Before answering the question, you are right. I think that we are in a very rare moment of, even in the history of capitalism, they have not of the faintest idea what to do. They have, I mean, this is one of the things that, and you know, in politics, in case you lose the momentum, you lose everything immediately, and then all the problems are going to eat you up. And I think this is what is happening, and this is how you explained. And I very much agree with this. Now, with regard to historical memory and then these linkages, first of all, Jobbik is not anymore more radical than Fidesz. Fidesz is completely occupying. It's, let me put it, it's CDU, CSU, AfD at the same time.
Right? So Jobbik is now...
Jobbik is first of all out.
Because it doesn't need to be there.
They could not challenge. They wanted to challenge Fidesz within their own nationalist field. They could not. They were started all kinds of maneuvers. When Fidesz was moving to the radical right, then they started moving toward the center. And then this move was partially successful, partially absolutely not successful. So now Jobbik is lost.
And its people and supporters have shifted to Fidesz.
I mean, some of them are shifting back to Fidesz, or shifting for Fidesz for the first time. And also, very importantly, Fidesz could completely monopolize the media. So I think the changes what we are reading every day now is something which is a new scenario. But here comes a point, what you asked, and then let me answer that as well. This issue of legitimacy with historical memory. Let me be a sociologist for a second. In this very modern global capitalism, where there is this enormous passivity in terms of, production on behalf of the population, which we have never seen before. The question of identity went up dramatically, and the new communication technology is very much for that. So we have all this kind of a flourishing of all kinds of identities. So to say that there is a homogeneous kind of a cultural landscape, I would say no. I mean, it's full of either zillions of identities, even in terms of right-wing identities, what they identify with and how it goes. Nonetheless, it's a funny paradox of the 1990s when all these public intellectuals were saying that, oh, it's how difficult it is to make a fish soup out of an aquarium, right? We all remember that. We got it. We are back to the, we are back to, they made a fish, so that is to say they were able to go back before the Second World War in terms of eradicating the memory of state socialism and then just making this a kind of a break in the normal history. So now in Hungary we have an everyday talk that everything should be changed in a way how it was before the Second World War. There are all kinds of things, whether it's 45, 44, they are playing with all kinds of things, but let's pay attention to that. I just read it while I was coming to London, that they are trying to remove the statue of Imre Nagy because it doesn't fit into the Parliament Square. From that, because it doesn't fit it because it was not there before 1946. Sure, Imre Nagy had no statue before 1945, but probably he is to be remembered
for 1956. A communist prime minister who criticized and took on and fought the Russians.
That I think he is really a big problem for many people, because
but still,
he was for national independence, but he remained a communist till the end of his life, which is this is why he is going to be a problem for a lot of people. But let's put that aside. You're right. This language is coming back, but once again, I'm not surprised. I'm doing demography as well a lot, and then I work a lot on population discourses. Look, in some ways, I think what we are seeing, I can understand it as a kind of a self-objectivation of society, as Lukacs put it, right? In the sense that what kind of a discursive heritage we have concerning population. It's all about, biopolitical competition. It's all about, Europe is declining and so on. Look at the figures. Europe is truly declining. Why are we surprised that this pre-Second World War talk is coming back, and why the liberal discourses are unable to push it through with regard to that? So in that sense, I'm not surprised at all, and I think history is doing its job. The problem is, of course, as once again going back, I think not only the capitalists have problems how to go ahead, but we as radical critics, we also lack a very clear vision where to go. So I think history is giving a lot of lessons to all of us.
It is going to be a long transition, this. It's not going to be solved easily, but let's come to something which is part of a huge problem now in most of Eastern Europe and in parts of Western Europe as well, that the shift in the culture of these countries from A to Z, let's put it like that, has meant that in Hungary the government wants to wipe out all historical memory that doesn't suit or fulfill its needs. So one of the greatest European intellectuals of the 20th century, Jurgen Lukacs, born in Budapest, taught in Budapest, a communist, a Marxist, debated numerous things within and without the communist system. His statue has already been taken down, and this is why I find it problematic, actually, when sometimes people, even from the left, say, let's pull down the statue of X or Y. I don't like it, and the reason I don't like it is because, in a way, what's the point of pulling down the statue of a horrific imperialist? What one should demand in these cases is, we want a plaque which says what he was from our point of view. not just the point of view of that state. Once you accept that the left has the right, then the right says, not that that's the case in Hungary, but okay, then we'll pull down the statues of X, Y, and Z as well. Well, here there aren't many to pull down, but in Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe there are. So the Lukacs campaign was very vicious.
That's true, although even here I can point out, I mean, the colonial heritage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's for sure. I mean, once I also studied at Oxford, so I remember, you know, quite a number of things which are really appalling there. I mean, just to mention. No, the problem is this very cheap anti-communism in Eastern Europe. I mean, it's intellectually so cheap. I mean, it reminds me of how Cuban emigres in Florida are talking about Cuba. So I think that's kind of a level we are talking about. And then, of course, in everybody's life you can find all kinds of things, and then they have this problem with Lukacs during the Soviet Republic, and then whether he was ordering shooting or not, and so on and so on and so on. But of course, you know, we cannot decontextualize from history such things. But the big problem, you're right. I mean, there is a great intellectual heritage he left behind. But East European countries are like this. They are like a house with two open windows. Anything they get, they throw it out immediately, and they are longing for a new thing at the same time. And at the same time, they are talking about tradition. So I think that they are making a huge mistake, and then to get rid of Lukacs, then to move his archives into the, you know, the back archives of the Hungarian Academy, not to teach him, not to use. I mean, I know only a few Hungarian people in terms of social thinkers who can be taught throughout the world. I mean, one is Lukacs, of course, he's taught everywhere, right? I'm going to travel to Brazil next week. There's Lukacs. I mean, you just can't live without Lukacs there.
Attila, we're going to end, but I want to ask you one last question. What is your own background? How did you become a radical?
Well, that's a good question. I've never wanted to become radical. Actually, yeah, I was critical in state socialism. I was coming from a mining district of Pécs, so I could see a very peculiar face of state socialism. I was attending a school where everybody was coming from a mining family or miner family. With the
so you come from a miners?
My family was not. No. My family was different. It's all kinds of different social backgrounds. One was, my grandfather was a Protestant pastor, and then he lost land because of state socialism. People were put into, I mean, my family was repressed in the early 1950s rather severely, including my father. The other side was luckier in a lot of ways, and then it had the different things. That family also, in the end, had some, let us say, real communists in the end, who were coming before the Second World War. Right. So that was there as well. No, I think the only thing what I was doing, I was reading, analyzing. I've been always doing this historical sociological research. And things were not coming out. And I was thinking about first, let's say, why is this idealization of the West? It doesn't make sense. And then I started working, deconstructing certain theories and problems. And then step by step, I ended up in being a radical. But even I would say, you know, it's very funny. We are talking about ourselves as being radical. We are the most responsible people. I mean, we are just saying for a system which is about grabbing and competing and kicking, we are saying that let's do it in a normal way. So we are the radical who is trying to calm down the situation, which I think they find it funny. So I think to be a radical leftist for me means enormous responsibility in order to calm down the situation, to reduce competition, globally speaking, and then to provide for the people for whom we can absolutely provide based on our technology and knowledge what we have already gathered.
Attila Melegh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.